That's it. Okay. So, okay. It's 7 o'clock, folks. We're going to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mila Stroganoff, Programs Director for the Friends of San Pedro Valley Park, and your host tonight. Thank you for joining me for the Natural History series that the Friends offer as a way to learn and broaden our horizons. And it's truly very kind of those of you who have taken time to write an email or a note saying how much you appreciate the webinars, the lectures, all the interaction we have with them. So thank you. We certainly appreciate the kind words Adrian and I do. Adrian, as you well know, heads the IT at home. He's right here beside me. And he's back of house, and he's membership director for the Friends and sends out all those great emails that inform you of upcoming events. And we will be back in September with a fascinating lecture on great white sharks. So something to look forward to. I've been meaning to get a program on great white sharks for a long time, and thanks to Colleen, I've been able to contact someone, and it looks like it's a go for September. Wow. Okay. So grab a cup of coffee or tea or something else that will perk you up during the talk. I'm very pleased to have Colleen Young, sea otter biologist at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in Santa Cruz, with us tonight. We will be recording the lecture, and so in a week or two, it will be posted on our website. And as you well know, we have some wonderful lectures up there already, natural history lectures. And our website is friendsofsanpedrovalleypark.org. friendsofsanpedrovalleypark.org. Also, while I have your attention, consider becoming a member and supporting the programming. The Q&A will be at the end of the lecture as usual, and we're not going to break up the lecture. And our chat usually is disabled for whatever reason. So please put comments, questions, whatever into Q&A. That shall simplify our lives and we'll know where to find everything. So don't put hands up and all the rest of it. Just put it in Q&A. So now I introduced the speaker. Very proud to introduce Colleen Young. And as I said, she's an environmental scientist and sea otter biologist at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response in Santa Cruz. She has been studying sea otters since 2010 and works on projects including population monitoring, recovery and examination of stranded sea otters, and capture, tagging, and tracking of wild sea otters. These studies are done collaboratively with partners including Monterey Bay Aquarium, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, UC Davis, and UC Santa Cruz. When not conducting sea otter research and monitoring, Colleen leads and participates in drills and trainings to prepare for an oil spill involving sea otters, which we hope never happens. So, Colleen, please take it away.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I'll start sharing my screen.
A little bigger. Bigger. Thank you.
Is that good?
That's it. That's good.
I'm like, that's as big as I can make it.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. I'm going to disappear.
Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to give you a general overview of sea otter biology and natural history, go over some key identifying characteristics, talk about the population status and how we monitor mortality, what sorts of mortality we see, causes of mortality. I'll touch briefly on some current conservation issues and potential solutions. And then I'll wrap it up with giving you an overview of sea otters in Pacifica, and finally end with how to report sea otter strandings and sightings. So to kick things off, I just want to give you some general background about sea otters. And I want to start with some basic information about their reproduction. So sea otter females have one pup at a time and produce one pup per year, starting at about age 3 to 4. And one thing that a lot of people ask me is, what season do sea otters give birth, or when's pupping season? And the answer is that sea otters give birth year round. So that's really different than a lot of our pinniped species that we have, that all come together and haul out on shore and have to synchronize their breeding at a specific time of year. Sea otters have a completely different strategy. As soon as the female weans a pup, she comes into estrus and will mate pretty much right away. She'll pair bond with a male for usually a few days, and will mate during that time multiple times. And they have about a 6-month gestation, which includes a 2-month delayed implantation period. And during that delayed implantation, basically the embryo is frozen in suspended animation. And then after that 2-month delayed implantation, then the gestation will progress. And after 4 months, so the 2-month delayed implantation and the 4-month actual development, to give you the total 6-month gestation, she'll give birth, and then she'll take care of that pup for about 6 months. So the females are on a pretty consistent 1-year cycle, and they are basically, as soon as they become reproductively mature, they are basically either pregnant or taking care of a pup for the rest of their lives. They don't have any documented senescence where they would stop reproducing as they get older. They just keep cycling until they die. So sea otter moms work really hard. They have, as you probably have heard, the densest fur of any mammal, which is part of the reason, or the main reason, that they were hunted almost to extinction during the fur trade. And in the pups, they actually have a slightly different fur that they're born with that's extremely buoyant. And during the first several weeks of the pup's lives, it's actually, they're not able to dive because the fur is so buoyant. But they will start to shed that fur and get their adult fur over time. And by 10 to 13 weeks old, they'll have mostly their adult fur. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about their fur in a minute. I think one of the most fascinating things about sea otters is their diet. They, unlike a lot of other marine mammals, at least in California, don't eat fish. Occasionally they will, very rarely, but for the most part, they're eating benthic invertebrates. So those are invertebrates that primarily live on the seafloor. And it's been documented that they consume over 75 different species of invertebrates, including clams, crabs, mussels, octopus, snails. And of course, everyone thinks about abalone and urchin as kind of being the classic sea otter food, but they eat lots of different things. And even some squid and other kind of interesting invertebrates. And some otters have evolved or have gained the ability to use tools to open their prey. And so you might hear or see an otter banging their prey on a shell or a rock or something on their that's on their chest to help break it open. You may see them using the side of a boat or a piling in a harbor, anything hard to help them break open their hard-shelled prey, which is pretty unique for a marine mammal. You know, there's lots of documented prey use in chimpanzees and other primates. There's some documented prey use in dolphins, but sea otters are really diverse in the way that they use tools, and they can use them really effectively. They also have a high rate of individual prey specialization, especially in areas that are really resource limited, like where sea otters have existed for a really long time, and there's a lot of sea otters. So in those situations, there's a lot more competition for food. And so it's advantageous for individuals to get really good at eating 3 or 4 different types of prey. And you'll see those individuals eat those prey items really consistently, even if other types of prey become more abundant in the environment. We also know that females will pass along their prey specialization to their pups. So during that 6-month dependency period, when the pups are with their mothers, they will, be learning from her what to eat and how to eat it. So if the mom is a tool user, the pup usually becomes a tool user as well. So there's a high degree of matrilineal transfer of prey preferences. They have really high caloric requirements that I'm going to talk about in a couple slides here. So they eat a really high volume of food every day. And what's cool about their foraging strategy, at least for us, is that they bring their prey to the surface to consume it, which allows us to observe what they're eating and how they're doing it. So unlike some marine mammals that hunt underwater and may consume their prey underwater, and it's a lot harder to see what they're doing and what they're eating. These guys always bring it to the surface. So it's really cool to see what they're munching on. Now, in terms of diving, they're pretty mediocre in terms, at least compared to other marine mammals when it comes to diving. Their average dive depth is only 24 feet deep, and their average dive duration is about a minute. So these guys are really only primarily diving to get food. So they're only going to go as deep or as long as they need to obtain prey. They don't do a lot of diving just for fun. But in certain circumstances, their prey is a lot deeper if they're over deep water. And so the deepest dive that's been recorded for a sea otter is 264 feet, and the longest dive is almost 8 minutes. So they do have the capacity to do deeper and longer dives. But that's a huge energy expenditure for them. And so they tend not to do that unless they really have to. And even with their record-setting dives, their diving capabilities still are not very impressive compared to the pinnipeds and obviously the cetaceans. So I want to talk a little bit about group dynamics. You probably have seen pictures of or seen in real life big groups of otters. That's called a raft. And if you look closely, or once you're a little bit have a trained eye, what you would notice is that for the most part, all the groups are going to be one sex or the other. So female groups are the most common that you would probably see. And basically, if there's one or more pups in the group, it's going to be a female group. Males, though, can also form groups, and males have kind of interesting behavior because if they're holding a territory, there will be usually one male in the female group, but it's really energetically costly for them to defend their territory all the time. And so there are periods where they're not defending their territory and they may travel to a different area and raft up with other non-territorial males. So the top picture is just a mom and pup, and the bottom picture is a male group. The group dynamics and those tendencies to form groups really drives the home range size of these animals. So females tend to rest together, but they also have really high sight fidelity, which means they tend to come back to the same place, and they have a really small home range, usually on the order of 1 to 5 kilometers along the coastline. And she'll spend pretty much her entire life in that small home range, including, doing all the things that she needs to do. So resting and foraging. There are exceptions to that. We do have evidence that some females travel longer distance, especially younger females. But for the most part, females tend to stay in a pretty small area. Males, on the other hand, when they're holding a territory, they may, they're going to stay within whatever size territory they're guarding. But when they're not holding a territory, and especially young males that are dispersing once they've been weaned, they can travel hundreds of kilometers. And we've had some tagged males that have regularly made the transit between where we tag them near Southern California around Point Conception up to San Luis Obispo and back and forth. So and also between Elkhorn Slough near Moss Landing and Monterey. So males are more regularly traveling great distances and have a much bigger home range. So I want to wrap up the natural history section with just kind of painting you a picture of what it's like to be a sea otter. So these are animals that have no blubber. That's a really different strategy than a lot of marine mammals that use their blubber to stay warm in these cold Pacific waters. So what sea otters do to stay warm is they've got dense fur. We talked about that, the densest fur of any mammal. And that fur requires intensive maintenance in order for it to keep them warm. So they do that by doing extensive grooming sessions where they are manipulating the fur. They're physically manipulating it. They're licking it. They're touching it with their paws to align it. But they also blow air into the base layer, like the root of their fur that's against their skin. And they're actually able to trap a layer of air under the fur or under the outer fur. Basically, it works like a dry suit where that air will stay against their skin and be insulated by the fur on top of it and keep them warm. But that requires extensive maintenance in order to keep that waterproofing so that they're not getting wet to their skin. They also have a high rate of metabolic heat loss. And I alluded a little bit to the fact that they have really high energy requirements. So they're typically eating 25 to 30% of their body weight a day in prey. And when they're processing that food, there is heat loss, heat generated through their metabolism of all of that prey. And that also helps them to keep warm. So basically, a sea otter will spend up to several hours foraging, and then they'll groom themselves and get any debris or anything off of their fur, so it's insulating them well, and then they will rest, and that's the time that they need to digest and kind of rejuvenate, and then they do that all over again, and they do that cycle all throughout the day and night, 24 hours a day, that kind of rotation of activities. And because it is pretty hard for them to get the calories that they need just to kind of maintain a healthy body weight, they are really vulnerable to things like disturbance. So if kayakers are repeatedly coming towards them while they're trying to rest and they're constantly swimming away to try to avoid kayakers or boaters, that's time that they're not resting, they're expending energy, and they have to make up all of that energy that they're expending, get it fleeing, and also make up, for the fact that they're not resting. So they are really vulnerable to disturbance. And that's especially true for adult females, because as I mentioned, an adult female is always either caring for a pup or pregnant. And she is having to eat even more calories than even like a large male otter in order to meet her energy requirement for herself and her pup. So she is adult females are especially vulnerable to disturbance. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, I've had a lot of pictures of live otters. So hopefully you've got kind of a snapshot of what they look like, but I want to show you some close-ups of some features that really make an otter an otter. So, and I apologize. So a lot of my work is on dead otters. So I have a lot of pictures of dead otters, but it really helps illustrate some of the points. So when you're identifying a sea otter, and there are some other critters that can look similar. Like we get a lot of reports of live river otters that are reported as sea otters. Northern fur seals and Guadalupe fur seals can look kind of similar to sea otters because they have shaggy fur. But the key features that makes a sea otter is they have paws for their front limbs. So they don't have flippers like a lot of the pinnipeds. They do have flippers in the back, but as you can see, the morphology is pretty different than a seal or a sea lion. They also have a really long tail. So most pinnipeds have a just short stubby tail, inch or two long, that's much shorter than their hind flippers. But you'll see the sea otter tail goes either at least two, but usually well beyond the end of the flippers, and it's dorsoventrally flattened. It's really, really flat, and they actually use their tail to help them kind of scull and move through the water if they're swimming on their back and just wanting to either stay in place or just kind of swim lazily. They can move their tail back and forth to help with propulsion. And the other thing that I think makes sea otters really unique, in addition to their dense fur, which we've talked about, is their dentition. So they have really flattened molars in the back that they can use to crush prey. As I mentioned, they eat hard-shelled prey. So if they're not using a tool, they're just putting the whole thing in their mouth and chomping it up, mussels and crabs. But they also have big sharp canines to defend themselves. So I highly recommend not getting bit by a sea otter, because not only will those canines puncture you, but their molars, if your hand is in there or something, will crush your hand as well. So really strong bite force, really well adapted for eating the prey that they do and for defending themselves. So now I'll shift gears and tell you a little bit about the population status of this subspecies. So there are 3 subspecies of sea otters, and in California we have the southern sea otter. And I'll show you the other 2 subspecies here on the next slide. So the scientific name is Enhydra lutris nereus, and this subspecies, and actually all sea otter subspecies, are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is a little bit different than other marine mammals, which are managed by NOAA and nymphs. So the pinnipeds and cetaceans are managed by nymphs, and kind of the oddball marine mammals, polar bears, manatees, and sea otters are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They are listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and they're fully protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act and also by the state of California. They, at least according to our last full annual census, which occurred in 2019, we had about 13,000 sea otter, or sorry, 3,000. I wish it was 13,000. 3,000 sea otters in California, and historically, it's thought that they had numbered closer to maybe 15 to 20,000. So and we are actually in our annual census period right now. We do it in May, and we do both ground surveys and aerial surveys to cover the whole range to count sea otters. So we're hoping that we'll have an updated population estimate this year. We haven't, the reason why we don't have a estimate since 2019 is because COVID made it a challenge to do our aerial surveys, and some other factors as well. But we're hoping to get a full survey this year. And before I move on, this figure shows the current range of sea otters in California with this red line along the coastline from Pigeon Point in the north to Gaviota in the south. And I want to just call out, you'll see San Nicolas Island is surrounded here too. And sea otters were translocated to San Nicolas Island in the 1980s. And took a really long time for that population to take hold, but it has actually started growing out there. So there's about 100 to 150 sea otters out at San Nicolas Island, which is one of the Channel Islands. So just to give you a sense of where sea otters used to be distributed before the fur trade, basically they were continuous along the Pacific Rim from Japan through Russia, the Aleutian Islands, all down the coast of Alaska and Canada, and then the whole west coast of the US and even into Baja California, Mexico. And you can see there the 3 different subspecies two different subspecies of northern sea otter, and then the southern sea otter. And you'll see too that the populations there off British Columbia and Washington were translocated populations. So they had moved otters from the Aleutian Islands and other areas to areas like British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, and Washington. And you'll see that in green here, it shows the current distribution of southern sea otters. So it's just a really small fragment of their historic range, which for this subspecies in particular was basically southern Oregon through down through Baja California. And I've alluded to a couple times that sea otters were nearly extirpated during the fur trade. And so many of you may have heard that in California, there was a remnant population of about 50 individuals off of the coast of Big Sur. And all of the sea otters that we have today are descended from those individuals. So we have pretty low genetic diversity within the southern sea otter. But this figure here on the right shows you the expansion of the range over time from that small little group in Big Sur to the current distribution today, which, as I mentioned, was Pigeon Point in the north, which is shown with this upper orange circle down to Gaviota in the south, which is this lower orange circle. So sea otters basically expanded their range pretty steadily for several decades from the late 1930s till about 2002. And then for the last 2 decades or so, the range expansion has been fairly stagnant, where we really haven't seen them moving north or south. And I'm going to talk about why we think that is in just a moment here. But before I get into that directly, the last thing that I want to touch on here is one of the metrics that we use to monitor the population, in addition to the sea otter population counts and looking at the abundance and distribution throughout the range, is we also monitor mortality. And that's a big role that our group at the Department of Fish and Wildlife plays. And we do that in partnership, though, primarily with the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Marine Mammal Center, but also in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. And as a team collaboratively, we make up the Southern Sea Otter Stranding Network, and we respond to and try to investigate every Southern Sea Otter live, injured, and dead stranded otter that is reported to us. And so by stranded, I mean if it's dead, washed up on the beach, or floating dead, or if it's alive, but injured or ill and washed up on the beach. That's what I mean by stranded. And this monitoring work in California started in 1968. So we have over 50 years of data. And we conduct anywhere from kind of brief cursory exams where we're getting really basic kind of age, sex information to, in some cases, really detailed exams where we're trying to figure out everything that was going on with that animal, not only what killed them, but what other things they might have been dealing with at the same time. We save a bunch of samples and do diagnostic testing, really try to tell the stories of those animals. And we prioritize most of that effort towards animals that we have some history on, so tagged animals that we followed when they were alive. To give you a sense of the type of numbers that we've been seeing, this shows our annual strandings through all of California since 1968 till 2023. And you can see that the number of stranded animals has precipitously increased. And for the most part, it's kind of kept step with the growth of the population during that same time frame. But we haven't had a lot of population growth over the last 10 to 15 years. And that's partly because they've also not been expanding their range. And basically the areas that have otters now are supporting as many otters as the environment can. So we call that being at carrying capacity. So we're at a really interesting time where the population's kind of stagnant But we are seeing changes in mortality numbers here. So I'll dig into that a little bit more here. And I just, because of where you guys are located up in Pacifica, I wanted to show you this regional geographic distribution of strandings. So these 3 bars here represent 3 different time frames. The blue bars are the 10-year average for the previous 10 years, so 2013 to 2022. The orange bars are 2022, and the green bars are the most recent year we have data for, 2023. And what I want you to notice here is that we don't get that many otters. Less than 5% of the stranded sea otters are from north of Point Santa Cruz. So that's not all that surprising because, as I mentioned, the northern extent of the sea otter range is Pigeon Point, so just a little bit of Año Nuevo. And so it makes sense that we don't get a whole lot of otters up in that area. The majority of the stranded sea otters that we get are from the Monterey Bay and Monterey Peninsula and Estero Bay down to like Pismo Beach area. And what I want also to point out about this figure is that although it shows that we don't have a lot of strandings in Big Sur and the kind of San Simeon to Cambria area, that area we know has a lot of sea otters and has been occupied by sea otters for a really long time. These low numbers are an artifact of there not being a lot of sandy beaches down there where sea otter carcasses tend to wash up and be retained. But also, you know, in Big Sur, you just don't have the population numbers of people to find and report the otters, and low cell service. So there's a lot of factors that influence the really low reporting and recovery in those areas, but it's not an accurate representation of what true mortality is in those areas. And even in the areas where we do have high reporting, we know we're still not getting all of the stranded otters because we're just relying on the public to call it in when they come across it. So I'll give you just a quick snapshot of the different types of causes of stranding that we see. And this figure has the same color scheme as the previous slide, with the blue bars being the 10-year average, the orange bars being the 2022 numbers, and the green bars being 2023. And on the y-axis, we've got the percent of sea otter strandings. And on the x-axis, we've got the cause of stranding category. So what I want you to notice is that for the most part, we don't have a huge variation from year to year in the distribution of types of strandings. And we typically see about 35 to 45% of the cases that we recover have an unknown cause of stranding, an unknown cause of death. And that's because, as you can see from this picture here, and sorry I didn't warn you that it's a little gross, but a lot of the cases that by the time we hear about them, they're decomposed or they're scavenged, or they just have a condition that's not obvious by just looking at it visually. So we have a high rate of unknown, but we still can learn a lot from those animals because we're still learning, or we're still recording their age and their sex. And we basically record as much as we can off of every carcass. The next most common cause of stranding is shark bite. And that's a cause of mortality that's really increased over the last 10 to 15 years. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I'll get into it maybe in the Q&A if people are interested in chatting about that. And it might be interesting. I think it'll dovetail well with what you'll learn from Sal when he gives his talk in September. But basically, a short story is we think that there's more sharks than there used to be, and there's more spatial and temporal overlap between sea otters and sharks because of climate change, and there being warmer water for longer periods of time, and in areas that used to have colder water that's more hospitable to sharks and that overlaps with sea otters. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is that this picture shows a pretty clear shark bite pattern on this animal, but this is actually really rare for us to see. The majority of shark bite cases that we see, there are kind of random lacerations all over the animal. And sometimes it's only 2 or 3, sometimes it's several, but they can be in different orientations. And we think it's because, for the most part, the otters may be either reacting when they're being bit and kind of moving, and that can cause the skin to tear. But also the otters can be in all sorts of different orientations when they're bit. So if they're resting at the surface and get bit, yeah, maybe they're going to get this half moon pattern. But if they're just coming up from a foraging dive or they're grooming, they may be in a much different position or posture when we're looking at them on the table compared to when they were actually bit by the shark. So the wound patterns it can seem a little random, but if you think a little bit about the otter's behavior and what they might have been doing, it can potentially shed some light on what that interaction looked like. And the last thing I'll say about shark bite wounds, sea otters are not a particularly good prey item for sharks. They don't have, because as I mentioned, they don't have blubber. That's typically what the sharks are going after when they're going for a pinniped, which is their intended prey. And most of the bites that we see reflect that it's probably more of an investigatory bite, where the shark is kind of biting gently to test what it is. They bite in, they get a lot of fur and no blubber, and then they release. And we very rarely see any tissue missing as a result of that bite. It's not a predatory bite. It's an investigatory bite in almost all the cases. And in some cases, the otters can survive, but in many cases, it's fatal for them. So, or either directly because of things like blood loss or because of heat loss through these holes, or also it can be because those wounds get infected and they can die from the secondary infection. So it's a really interesting dynamic because it's something that we can't really control, but it's something that we are documenting and trying to learn more about. And just a couple of other common causes of stranding, got a miscellaneous category, and that's kind of a catch-all for all sorts of things that we might consider natural, which, although as we're learning more, we're learning that human activities are influencing a lot of these natural causes of stranding. So those are things like protozoal parasites or other types of parasites. That's things like biotoxins, like domoic acid. This can be things like wounds inflicted from another otter, from biting or from mating. Kind of a catch-all category, that miscellaneous category. And then our last kind of big common category is dependent pups that get separated from their moms. I talked about a little bit like how much energy the moms are putting into their pups, and those pups are completely dependent on their mom. So if they get separated, if there's a large storm, or for any reason, those pups are not going to survive. So they'll either strand alive, and hopefully they're a good candidate for rehabilitation and they might get re-released, or if they're not found in time, then they may die. And the last thing I want to point out here is the anthropogenic causes of stranding. Luckily, represent a pretty low percent of the overall strandings. Typically, we'll see a handful, maybe 1 or 2 boat strike cases a year. Every few years, we might have 1 or a few gunshot cases. Luckily, those are not very common. We'll see fishing line entanglements occasionally, but luckily, in the scheme of things, they're pretty low numbers for anthropogenic. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions here. So I'm just going to wrap up by kind of bringing it all together to talk about what the key conservation issues are for sea otters right now. So as I mentioned, most of the areas in California that have sea otters have as many sea otters as the environment can support, at least as far as we know, based on conditions now. So we call that we say that they're at carrying capacity. There's also limited opportunity for sea otters in California to naturally expand their range. Basically, their only options are to go north or south. And that's pretty different from other areas like in British Columbia or Southeast Alaska, where there's a lot of islands and more two-dimensional space for otters to move to expand their territory or expand their range. California, it's basically just along the coastline. And we happen to have white sharks at both ends of their current range. And when we have a pretty high mortality rate from white shark bites in those two areas. So we feel that that white sharks are probably limiting their ability to expand further north or south at this point. So the main conservation focus for sea otters that's being discussed, and that's mostly being facilitated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the agency that has management authority over the species, is the consideration of possibly reintroducing sea otters to unoccupied historic habitat in Oregon and or California. So there's a lot of discussions happening around this concept. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put out a feasibility assessment and found that hypothetically, it could be feasible to reintroduce sea otters to these historic areas. And so there's a lot of discussions right now about what that might look like, how it might happen, what groups should be involved, all sorts of things. So a decision has not been made about whether it will happen, but that is the primary conservation initiative that folks are working on right now to try to help sea otters expand their range and hopefully expand their population size. And just to finish things off here, I want to give you a snapshot of what sea otter activity we have in Pacifica. So as I mentioned, the official northern range limit of sea otters is at Pigeon Point right now. It has been as far north as Half Moon Bay in the past. The northern extent of the range has contracted a little bit, but we do occasionally get live sightings that are reported of sea otters that are doing well. They're doing fine. And I queried the data, and we've had 17 strandings of sea otters in the Pacifica area. And I've just made this table here to give you a little snapshot of who they were, when they were. So dating back to 1986 and as recent as 2015, these are the stranded sea otters that have been reported in the Pacifica area. And the thing that just jumps out at me the most is that almost all of these animals were male. And that's really common. We call these animals extralimital, so beyond the established limit or the established range. And almost all of our extralimital strandings are male otters. They're the ones I talked about. They have the large home ranges. They can move great distances. So historically, they have been the ones to check out new areas and kind of establish new areas outside their current range and kind of help move the expansion of the geographic range. And then eventually the females will, as I mentioned, the females have really small home ranges. So they only make really small kind of incremental moves, but usually it's the males that are kind of out exploring new areas. So it's not surprising to me that the majority of the stranded animals that have been found in that area have been male. And the cause of stranding for a lot of them were unknown. You'll notice a lot of them were kind of advanced decomp. We have some shark bite cases, a domoic acid intoxication case, protozoal infection, and one suspected gunshot case. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot of what otter activity has been like in the Pacifica area. And I did a little query of the extralimital sightings database that we have, and I found just like a handful of live otters that were sighted, swimming in the water in that area. So I'll end with just asking that if you do see a sea otter, to report it as soon as possible. So if you see live healthy otters in the water just hanging out, I'd appreciate an email just so we can add that sighting to our database, and a photo or a video would be really helpful to have with that, just so we have that documentation. If you happen to see a stranded sea otter, I've got our numbers listed here, but also if you just Google stranded sea otter, California, contact, all this information will come up as well. And if you are reporting a stranding, it's super helpful to record the GPS coordinates. Think about what the closest access point is, not necessarily where you got on the beach, but where someone having to carry out a heavy animal would be able to get on, and at the closest point to that animal. If it's not above the high tide line and you have a way to safely move it up so it doesn't wash out before responders can get there, that's helpful. If you see tags on the hind flippers, that's helpful to know. We tend to prioritize getting to those animals more quickly because we have information about them that we want to pair with the postmortem information, and relative size is helpful as well. Highlighted the tags here. And just to give you a little comparison, the tags on sea otters always go on the hind flippers, and that's different than fur seals, which are usually tagged kind of in the armpit area, or like close to the armpit on the front flipper. And harbor seals can be tagged in different locations, but typically on the hind flipper as well. Same with sea otters, but the tags are all a little bit different. So if you're not sure what you're looking at or about the tagging information, photos are super helpful. So a photo, that shows the animal well enough that someone's going to be able to tell what species it is, and then a photo farther back that shows some landmarks or something in the background are really helpful. And anything you can put in there that shows the relative size. It's really helpful to know if we're going out to pick up like a small juvenile or a full adult, because the equipment and the personnel that we might bring can be a little different. So I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than I intended, but I want to make sure I have time to answer your questions. So with that, I want to acknowledge all the collaborators that I work with on all of our sea otter work. And with that, I'll take questions. So I'm just going to go through.
Thanks very much, Colleen. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm trying to unmute and get the video going on my part here. So we do have questions, obviously. And one of the very first ones that popped up had to do with this delayed implantation. And what is the benefit of that? Obviously, there are other animals that do have that happen. And so.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So a lot of marine mammals have delayed implantation so that they keep their timing. So that because they are seasonal breeders, and they all like pinnipeds, they come to the beach at the same time, they all breed at the same time. That's why most species have delayed implantation. But for a sea otter, we think it's to give the female some time for her body to recover and regain her energy stores. Because basically, if you look at most females, when they wean their pups, they are skin and bones. They are so skinny, all of their fat, all of their caloric resources are depleted. So it gives her a chance to forage and kind of rebuild her energy stores before before pregnancy starts moving along, because that in itself takes a lot of energy, let alone provisioning the pup once it's born. So we think it's just to allow her to regain her body condition.
So Bevan is asking about the correlation of kelp growth and sea otter population. And if one dies back, does it affect the other?
Yes. So so it's more, the short answer is it's more complicated than we thought. For years, everyone kind of referred to this paradigm of sea otters eat urchins and control urchins, which helps allow kelp to grow. And when sea otters are absent, that urchins can go unchecked and mow down all the kelp. And that is true in some ecosystems, like out in the Aleutian Islands. That relationship is fairly straightforward and has been shown multiple times. In California, what we're learning is there's other species that are really important for controlling sea urchins and affecting kelp. So, as you guys probably know, that we've had a massive kelp loss in California since about 2014 or 2015. And there's some speculation about whether or not, if sea otters had been in those areas whether that, especially in Northern California, whether that would have happened. And what we see in areas with sea otters, like in the Monterey Bay area, the kelp loss has not been as severe. But what I will say is that sea otters don't eat urchins that don't have caloric value. And sea urchins in kelp or in urchin barrens really don't have caloric value. So if the urchin barrens have already taken hold and the kelp is gone, it's not likely that sea otters are going to come in and take care of all those urchins and the kelp's going to grow back right away. But in areas where there is still some kelp, which is food for the urchins, and the urchins have caloric value, the sea otters can help maintain the kelp beds that exist and slowly start help expanding that kelp bed into areas that were formerly urchin barren. So it's a really dynamic relationship because there's lots of other players in California, like the sea stars, that are part of that relationship. But that's kind of a shortest, longish answer to that question.
And thank you, Colleen. And in terms of reintroduction, I was thinking of the Bay Area, and there's a listener who is interested in the translocations and the San Francisco Bay. Considering it as you go further into the bay, you have brackish water, and there's a lot of activity in the San Francisco Bay. What chances are there of actually reintroducing otters to this area in this particular bay, which is closer to the...
It's a great question. So we know that sea otters can live in brackish water. They thrive in Elkhorn Slough, which is also an estuary. But I think everyone would acknowledge that San Francisco Bay looks a lot different today than it did the last time sea otters occupied that area. And there are a lot of question marks about whether they would thrive in San Francisco Bay. There are clearly a lot of risks to them in that area. There's also the thought that sea otters can help restore San Francisco Bay in areas that have diminished water quality and other issues like they've done in Elkhorn Slough. But it's obviously, it's quite different than Elkhorn Slough. It's much bigger and it's so much more urbanized. And so I think the verdict is still out on whether it would be a good idea to reintroduce sea otters into San Francisco Bay. It is being discussed, it is being considered, but I think it's way too early to speculate on whether that'll happen or not.
And with regards to baby otters, they obviously have their mother's milk initially, and then they move on to what foods? Do they eat exactly the same food that the parents eat?
Yep. So the first few weeks of life, they're nursing exclusively. They're only getting milk. But as early as 3 or 4 weeks old, the mom will start offering food to the pups. And for the next several months, the pup will have a combination of milk and food that its mom gave them. And then once it's able to start diving, once it sheds that natal pelage, it will start diving with its mom, and often will dive for the exact same types of prey that she's eating, because that's what they've learned how to find and learned how to eat. So they actually do nurse for the entire 6 months of their dependency. But as they get older, the proportion of milk goes down and the proportion of solid prey goes up till basically when they're weaned, they're able to forage on their own.
Excellent. Okay. You mentioned the 3 subspecies, and if you were looking at them from a physiological point of view, are you able to distinguish one from the other?
Morphologically, they're really similar. The northern subspecies at their largest size are bigger and heavier, so longer and heavier than the southern subspecies. But other than that, they're morphometric or morphologically indistinguishable. If you're doing genetics, you'll find more genetic diversity among the northern subspecies. But other than that, they would be capable of interbreeding if they came in contact with each other. genetically, they're not that different.
Well, they all stem from the same pod of 50 otters, right? So they can't really be that different,
The,
can they?
the, the southern, just the southern sea otter is descendant from those 50.
Ah, but is there much interaction for them from they're not in contact with northern ones, are they?
Not right now, but the hope is that if sea otters are reintroduced to Northern California and Oregon, eventually there could be intermixing with the northern sea otters that are currently in Washington.
Well, genetically, that would be great. I mean, to introduce some fresh genes into the pool, that would be fantastic. It would give them some resistance if anything happened.
It would, although northern sea otters tend to have, there's some overlap in the causes of mortality, but there's some differences as well. And so, like, for example, northern sea otters are much more prone to getting canine distemper, which is called morbillivirus. And so there's some concern that at some point, if there is interbreeding, there also could be novel diseases that are introduced that could be detrimental. So it's a balancing act for sure, and no one really knows what would happen.
No, one doesn't. Yeah.
So if there's northern and southern, what's the third subspecies?
There's two subspecies of northern sea otters. They're both considered northern, but they're genetically distinct.
Okay.
And so the northern would be the areas that you showed us along British Columbia up to Alaska over to the Aleutians and so on and so forth.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then so that's one species, like the Aleutian, from the Aleutians down to Washington, and then the ones that are off, like in the islands off Russia and Japan, that's another northern subspecies.
Ah, okay. Well, that's clear. Yeah, okay. That's great. And do sea otters actually, I mean, I know do they actually get onto land? One of the speakers was, one of the attendees was asking whether or not they actually land on, get out of the water and actually do any land walking as much as they can.
They do. They're pretty awkward to watch walking on land. They're not particularly graceful, but in areas where there's not a lot of people, they actually haul out quite a bit. In Elkhorn Slough, it's extremely common. You can see them like any time of day hauling out, especially like there's if you Google Elkhorn Slough otter cam, they have a remote camera and there's moms and pups hauled out in the pickleweed all the time. So they'll haul out to rest and warm up. And other areas like down near in the Monterey Peninsula, they're known to haul out on offshore rocks. But if they don't haul out in areas where people are around because they're pretty vulnerable when they're on land. They move pretty slow, and yeah, they're really skittish on land. So you don't see it a lot if there's a lot of people around. But also if they're sick or injured, that's when you're more likely to see it. Is when they're so far debilitated that they're willing to haul out even if there's people around, then usually there's something wrong.
I've seen otters at Elkhorn Slough, but they're a ways away. They don't really want to come out and see us or be anywhere near us.
Yeah, exactly. Which is probably a good strategy based on what's happened to them historically.
Yes, exactly. We haven't been at all kind to them at all. And there's Patricia is asking about how big a percentage die off from toxoplasmosis.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Because it's something that got a lot of media coverage like 10 years ago, like don't flush your cat litter because it's going to kill otters. And so it's something that the public really has latched onto. And it's cool that people are interested and they know about a disease that affects sea otters. But the reality is that a lot of sea otters are infected. In fact, up to 70% of male sea otters are infected with toxoplasmosis, but a really small percentage die from it. So it's just like, diseases that circulate in the human population that a lot of us have been exposed to and we'll have antibodies to it, but we're not actually getting sick or dying from it. And that's the same case with toxoplasmosis, where it does kill some animals, but for the most part, it's not really causing disease or illness.
And Lisa is asking how the reintroductions or translocations, as you call them, actually what is involved, how does it take place, how, you know, what's carried out in terms of accomplishing this feat.
Yeah, so the historic translocations were primarily moving animals from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to other places in Alaska, like Southeast Alaska. They translocated also to British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. And a lot of that work was done in the 70s. And then there was the translocation in California from the mainland population to San Nicolas Island in the 80s. And since then, there haven't been any sea otter translocations. Some of those historic ones worked, some of them didn't. And so in thinking about reintroducing sea otters to historic areas in Northern California and Oregon, we're looking really carefully about what elements of those previous translocations were successful and which ones were not. And in terms of picking the locations, I can't speak to the historic ones, but I can say that for the current reintroduction considerations, there's a lot of discussion about what locations would be best. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, including adequate prey resources, potential risks to the otters, support from the community, infrastructure to monitor the animals and care for them if something happens. I mean, that's just like the tip of the iceberg of things to consider for potential locations for reintroducing otters. So it's a really complex, complicated issue.
No, that's yes, major endeavor that. In terms of the tagging of sea otters, is that who actually does it?
Most there's two ways that sea otter gets tagged. One is for research, where we're out capturing healthy wild otters and tagging them so that we can collect samples, biological samples, and then monitor them and learn about their reproductive success, their foraging success and diet preferences. We have a study right now in Elkhorn Slough where we're learning about the social interactions and social structure of the animals, in addition to monitoring their reproductive success and survival. So that's kind of one of our tagging programs, and that is done collaboratively. The permit is done or is under the U.S. Geological Survey, but it's a collaborative effort with them and the Monterey Bay Aquarium, our department. Lots and lots of groups come together for those efforts. The other way sea otters get tagged is if they strand and are rehabilitated. They get tagged before release so that we can monitor them post-release and find out if they're successful, and and find out what they're up to after their release. So those are the two main reasons that sea otters are tagged and monitored.
Colleen, the actual rehabilitation, whether of pups or whether if they're sick or, adults are sick, is that done mostly at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, or is there another location where this is actually taking place?
Yeah, so the Monterey Bay Aquarium has been the premier facility for rehabilitating sea otters and developed a lot of the methods, but I'm happy to report that the Marine Mammal Center has been able to start rehabilitating sea otters in recent years. And the aquarium is working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium is also working with the Aquarium of the Pacific to increase their pool of surrogate females that can help raise stranded pups. And the Aquarium of the Pacific just had their first successful surrogate reared pup that had stranded, was stabilized at the aquarium, and then sent to the Aquarium of the Pacific for that surrogacy. So they get the stranded pups get paired with a non-releasable captive female to help them learn how to forage and groom and do all the things that a sea otter needs to do to survive. So and the program may be expanding more to other facilities to help increase the capacity for rearing, especially stranded pups.
And the mothers are and the females are pretty helpful in that respect, or are they sort of choosy about the pups?
Yeah, it depends. So there's a lot of like intensive monitoring when they're first introduced, and there's certain things that they look for to see if the mother is going to take the female is going to take to that pup and want to adopt it. But man, once they do, they really bond with the pups. And
Well,
they do incredible work. Things that that humans used to try to do to teach the pups, how to be otters, and the surrogate moms are just so much better at it.
I'm sure they are. I don't think we're great otters. You were mentioning the waters, the white sharks, and the fact that there's, in all probability, an increase in the white sharks and the population of white sharks. And you were going to address the issue of this cold water, warmer water,
Yeah.
global warming of oceanic waters. Can you address that?
Yeah. So basically, like, well, at least the theory that I subscribe to is that there are more white sharks in and off the coast of California for a couple of reasons. One is they have abundant prey resources. The pinniped populations are quite robust. So there's plenty of natural food to sustain white shark populations. Second is there was a ban on gillnet fishing in nearshore waters in Southern California a little over 20 years ago. And because of that ban, there was a huge reduction in the bycatch of young white sharks in California. So there used to be, like 20 years ago, a lot of white sharks, young white sharks used to die in gillnets as bycatch in the gillnet fisheries. And when those were banned, basically it removed that source of mortality. But white sharks have a really slow maturation and a late reproduction. And so like they don't reproduce until they're at like about 20 years old or more. And so we're just now seeing the impact of that ban, because white sharks that didn't get caught in the gill nets and die 20 years ago are finally at a reproductive age and reproducing. So you're finally starting to see the increase in the population as a result of that gillnet ban. So those are two reasons that the white shark populations seem to be increasing and doing well. Lots of prey and less mortality. And the reason why that has an impact on otters is because not only are there more white sharks around, because white sharks have bit otters since we've been monitoring otter strandings since 1968. But the reason we think that we're seeing more of them is because one is we think there's more white sharks around, but also because as waters are warming, the white sharks are able to occupy areas that where the water used to be too cold, like off Santa Cruz. White sharks never used to hang out all year round or most of the year up in Santa Cruz. They'd go to the breeding areas. The adults would go to the breeding areas off the Farallones and Año Nuevo, and then the juveniles would be in Southern California. And the presence of the adults at Año Nuevo and the Farallones would be seasonal. But what we're seeing with the warmer water temperatures is that the sharks are more broadly distributed along the whole coastline, and they're here year round. So instead of having otter mortality from white shark bites occur mostly in the late summer and early fall when the white sharks were here, we're now seeing year-round mortality because the white sharks are here and overlapping with sea otters year-round and throughout the sea otter range.
Wow, that's an interesting trend.
Yeah, but it's an interesting, it's a conundrum because white sharks are a protected and a really important species, and sea otters are protected and a really important species. So it's a challenging issue to manage.
One's an apex predator and the other one's a keystone species, and
That's right.
you try, yeah, right, balancing act here, right? Well, we've upset the balance, so now things are going to be somehow or other rebalanced, I think, by nature, right? As
Yep,
much as possible.
exactly.
Right. Well, I believe we've gotten through all the questions, and I must say, I would so much like to thank you on behalf of everyone who attended, and on behalf of myself and the friends. It was a fantastically interesting lecture that you gave us with regards to otters. You really, really gave us a good idea of what they're like, and from physiology to morphology to everything else, and their natural cycles and so on and so forth. So very, very, very interesting. Thank you so, so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for attending. I hope everyone has a great night.
Right. All right. Good night, and thank you again, Colleen.
Hey, good night. You're
Yeah,
welcome.
thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm ending the webinar for everyone. So we'll see you all in September and in the following webinars. So take care. Have a great summer. Enjoy yourselves. Take trips. And we'll see you back.